My name is Dr. Steve Steinberg. I am the County of Los Angeles Geographic Information Officer. I work with a great team of GIS staff across all of our county departments and with our enterprise team to support GIS applications, analysis, and programs throughout the county and with our partners throughout the cities and other agencies and organizations. And it's my honor to be your host today for GIS Day. So just as a matter of some introductory remarks, I would like to give you some history. If you aren't familiar, GIS Day is actually a global event. There are people all over the world today hosting events at public agencies, academic institutions, local organizations throughout the world. And it's been a growing event over the last 22 years now. LA, as I said, is hosting its 14th annual event. So we began these in 2008 and have continued to do them annually ever since. For those who have been around for past events, you know that normally this is held as an in-person event at Grant Park outside of the LA County Hall of Administration. But during the pandemic last year and continuing this year, we've moved to a virtual format. The nice thing there is we've been able to draw in speakers and participants from a much wider geographic region than just those who could come downtown. So I'm really happy to welcome those of you who are from further afield, other parts of California, the country, or the world. We have at present and climbing over 500 people already registered, and you can see here a lot of public sector agencies, but also a good chunk of folks from the academic and student part of the world, the public, and the private sector. So I want to welcome you all here. Our goal over these next 2 days is really to share how GIS is being used to serve a whole host of different applications and opportunities, both in Los Angeles County with our own departments and organizations, but also more broadly in the industry with our speakers from other institutions, private sector, public sector, and so on. So hopefully as you take part through the program and listen to our speakers, you'll learn about a wide array of opportunities for how GIS is being used, and maybe it'll spark some ideas for you as well. Just a few logistical items. You've all obviously been to our GIS Day Event Site. That's where you registered for the event. I want to highlight at the top here, we have a number of buttons, some just added today. So you can always go to the schedule and speakers to see what's coming up in the agenda, read a little bit about our speakers and what their talks will be about. I'd also mention these other buttons, the exhibit hall, the map gallery, the cookie and cake contest, and the GIS Day game. Those are all live and work throughout the event, and in particular, the exhibit hall and map gallery will leave up through the week, so you can visit those at your leisure. Those are all virtual online components of the event that you can take part in. I want to give a big thank you to all the sponsors. Obviously, it's not just county GIS staff that put this together, but we work with a number of external partners who help us with putting on the program, providing support for the program. In particular, I'd like to thank EagleView again this year for providing their Zoom webinar platform to us to run and record the event so that we can do something that's as seamless as possible. We have a number of other sponsors there in the second tier who have supported us both through exhibits. Some of them are doing presentations, and they've provided the prizes that'll be distributed through the GIS Day game and the cake and cookie decorating contest. And then a whole bunch of others there at the bottom that are also participating in our exhibit hall and making our event and our map gallery that much more all-encompassing and exciting. So I do want to mention explicitly a few of these things. Don't forget our treasure hunt game that opened this morning, and it'll be open only during the next 2 days of the event. As far as prize eligibility goes, we'll leave it open for you to explore at your leisure beyond that. But if you do complete the GIS Day game today or tomorrow, you will at the end receive a certificate of completion, as well as an opportunity, if you'd like to enter into our door prize drawing. we'll be giving away a number of gift cards that were donated by our sponsors, as well as 5 personal 1-year licenses for Esri's ArcGIS for personal use. So if you are looking for an opportunity to get involved with GIS software, the game and the opportunity to win a 1-year license is a great opportunity to do that. As I mentioned, we have a very diverse exhibit hall, not just the sponsors I showed you earlier, but also a very wide array of other county departments. So you can visit and see what different departments across LA County are doing. You can see what some of our partners from the city of LA and other NGOs and organizations are doing, as well as our commercial and academic partners. So please visit them throughout the event. You'll have an opportunity to learn about their offerings and opportunities, whether that's ways to learn more about GIS in an academic sense, whether that's partners that might be interesting to work with on projects from a private industry or nonprofit or agency perspective. So there's approximately 40 exhibit hall exhibitors this year, and we encourage you to visit their pages. I know it's a little bit late. Hopefully some of you got the heads up earlier. We do have, again this year, a virtual cake and cookie decorating contest. The rules and entry form are on the top of the main site. It may be a little late to bake and decorate a cake by 5 o'clock, but if you can, go for it. Cookies might be quicker. There are a few rules about how you decorate it. To note, it's a LA County GIS Day entry. You can see a few of our winners from last year, from last year's contest. We had some really great entries, and we encourage anyone who still has a chance to bake something to do that. We will be announcing the winners tomorrow over the lunch hour. So, stay tuned for that as well. The other thing that's new this year, because we're not in person, but we wanted to give you an opportunity to interact with our exhibitors, is at the end of each day from 3 to 4 o'clock, a number of our exhibitors will have breakout rooms that are linked on their exhibit hall sites and also in the agenda. And you'll be able to go into their individual breakout rooms, which may be in Zoom or a different web platform, and talk to representatives of those organizations to learn about their products, their academic offerings, their work. So I'd encourage you to take note of which exhibitors are doing breakouts each day, so that you can make sure you take some time to visit with them, talk with them about their offerings and their use of geospatial tools. One other thing I'd like to mention, if you are interested in working in LA County as a GIS professional, on Friday of this week, I learned just yesterday from our Department of Human Resources, they will be posting job bulletins, which are announcements of forthcoming jobs. And then those will begin accepting applications on Monday, the 22nd. The window for applications is relatively short. I don't know the exact time. It's usually 7 to 10 working days. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested in any of the 6 positions listed there, GIS technicians, supervising technicians, analyst, specialist, or manager too, take a look at the DHR website link there, or use the QR code, and you can see what the job bulletins read and learn about the opportunities and expectations for applicants in each of those categories, and feel free to apply next week. I would note also, there are 3 positions that won't be listed for applications until early 2022, Senior GIS Analyst, Principal GIS Analyst, and GIS Manager 1. So keep an eye on that site, the HR site. You can actually set up a notification so you get emails when these position openings are listed. So I'd encourage you to check that out if you're interested in coming to work for us and joining the team at LA County. So with that, I want to turn to introducing our keynote speaker, and we'll turn it over to him in just a moment. Before I introduce our speaker though, both for our keynotes and all of our speakers throughout the day, I'd like to make a note that in your Zoom toolbar, you should see a icon that says Q&A with 2 bubbles. That is where you can post questions for our speakers during their talks as they come up, or right at the end as they're finishing up. And each day, myself or another moderator will draw questions from the Q&A window to ask the speakers. So that's how you can put your questions forward, and we'll try to answer as many of those questions as we can at the end of each talk. And we'll also be capturing the questions in text, so that where possible, speakers may have an opportunity to write out answers that we can post later if we don't get to all of your questions. So again, look for that Q&A button on your toolbar. It has 2 little bubbles, like people talking bubbles, and that's where you can enter in your questions throughout the day, today and tomorrow. So with that, I again would like to turn to introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. D'Artagnan Scorza. And Dr. Scorza is currently serving as the inaugural Executive Director of Racial Equity for Los Angeles County. And in this capacity, he's tasked with championing the elimination of structural racism, while also promoting efforts to deepen the county's work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Scorza's life's work is centered on building leaders who fight for equity in communities and schools. In his previous roles as the Executive Director of Social Justice the Social Justice Learning Institute, a UC Regent and President of the Board of Education for Inglewood Unified School District, he launched programs that helped youth of color become social justice leaders and college graduates. He has also helped to pass policies that prioritized $160 million for student services across UC campuses and secured $350 million to support school construction for K-12 schools. As a U.S. Navy and Iraq War veteran and civic leader, he has received numerous awards and accolades, including being recognized as one of the 40 emerging civic leaders under 40 in 2018, and received the UCLA Recent Graduate Achievement Award in 2016. Dr. Scorza has been quoted in multiple publications, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Huffington Post, Los Angeles Magazine, and several podcasts. And it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Scorza as a friend and collaborator, and he will be speaking to you today on mapping equity. So with that, I will stop my screen share and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that incredible introduction, Steve. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today, and incredibly excited about really the work that we're doing here in LA County, utilizing GIS to advance both racial equity, but also to improve the lives of the 10 million residents, 10 million plus residents that we serve. You got to hear a little bit about my background through my bio, but I'm from Los Angeles. I grew up here. I've had both the pleasure and honor of being able to serve my community in a number of capacities. And I think, you know, this sort of focus on service, right? This focus on being able to improve the way in which we deliver services, by and large, can help drive a lot of the work that we're doing here in LA County, but also can help really lift up the importance of utilizing tools like GIS to do so. So today I'm going to talk to you about what it means to improve life course outcomes and how we're connecting the use of this incredible platform to racial equity here in LA County. But first, I like to open it up with a land acknowledgement. And, you know, land acknowledgements seek to honor our Native and indigenous peoples. So we'll open up really by pausing and acknowledging the first peoples of this ancestral territory. This territory that was unceded, the land that we call today as Los Angeles County. With respect to their elders, past and present, we recognize the Tongva, Tataviam, and Chumash as the original stewards of this land, air, and water, and support them as they continue to lift up their stories and culture. Our intent with this statement is to show respect, to honor the truth, and to encourage more substantive and sustained action to correct the false narratives and practices that have sought to erase Indigenous peoples' history and cultures. So, given the opening up of this statement, obviously recognizing our history and understanding our relationship to the land is such an important aspect of the work that so many of you do in GIS. And so we really want to center truth, right? And center the lived experience and histories of the people that we're aiming to serve. So today we're going to talk about what it means to understand anti-racism. And we're going to talk about LA County's commitment to anti-racism and how we're using GIS to advance racial equity. And we'll have a little bit of time to do a bit of Q&A. So what does it mean to understand anti-racism? Well, I always start with this idea that many of our communities are experiencing racial disparities. As you can see with these charts that are provided here, many communities of color, especially African-American, Latino, Latina, and or Asian American communities have faced the greatest impacts as it relates to COVID and the pandemic, are often facing some of the greatest disparities as it relates to life expectancy, educational attainment, or even income and earnings. These disparities are grounded in a series of sort of historical factors that are structural, that have emerged from either institutional practices, both in public and private institutions, or through sort of spatial conditions that exist, the neighborhoods that people grow up in, or even the relational experiences that people have, the networks they're a part of, and or the conditions they experience within community. These very disparities that we experience and that many of our community members experience are centered in this construct of intergenerational disadvantage. And what we know about intergenerational disadvantage is that it largely emerged in the past 50 years because of a growth in declining employment and earnings. There has always been concentrated intergenerational disadvantage, and I'll get to that a bit later, but in the past 50 years, the trends have been such that declining employment and earnings, along with local, state, and federal policies, have led to a growth in disadvantaged families. Along with that, we've also seen stagnant educational attainment, which is one of the primary tools that communities are able to use to grow their opportunity to earn more income or to move into things like home ownership, et cetera. And over time, we've seen that there are gender-specific effects upon outcomes. And what that leads to is an intergenerational phenomenon that shapes the employment prospects of the next generation. Employment and income is linked to so many important factors in our lives, again, such as being able to own a home and build wealth, improving opportunities for health, accessing good food, right? It's such a critical factor that when we see declining employment and earnings in families, we're more likely to see stable poverty in neighborhoods, which is why you see economic vulnerability in certain communities where folk are either over-policed or underprotected from violence due to reduced police legitimacy and police effectiveness with regard to crime. You combine with that issues like mass criminalization, such as the war on drugs or immigration policies or incarceration policies, which have led to the removal of income earners from households as well. That sort of growth in single parent families, declining educational attainment, combined with these local, state, and federal laws, have created a rise in concentrated and accumulated disadvantage. That rise in concentrated poverty and joblessness that has occurred again since the early 70s has led to a concentration of negative factors associated with it, like poverty, associated with poverty like crime, violence, poor school quality, and drugs. All of that influences the opportunities that we're able to take advantage of in our lives and over our lifetime, mainly our life course outcomes. Now, there are things that we start with, like our physical health, things that we build over time, like our cognitive skills and social-emotional skills. But all of these things that we sort of begin with as humans and are part of our development as humans can certainly influence our life course outcomes, which are institutionally defined milestones that are tied to specific age spans. But it's primarily the environmental and ecological factors that influence those life course outcomes and the dimension of human development. So for example, the families that we grow up in, the neighborhoods that we live in, the schools that we attend, the public systems that touch our lives, all shape our opportunity. our choice is situated and constructed within the context of these factors. So for example, you can't choose to eat healthy food if no healthy food exists within your community. If you grew up in a place like I did, which is Inglewood here in California, then you may have experienced a plethora of fast food restaurants and liquor stores, right? Those fast food restaurants and liquor stores in your environment may limit your opportunity to access healthy food if the grocery store was not nearby, for example, or if one doesn't have access to transportation, or if one's income makes it nearly impossible to afford fresh fruits and veggies on a regular basis. It is more likely that you're going to experience higher rates of diet-related diseases, such as hypertension and/or diabetes, and your choices are only as good as your opportunities. So often we like to blame people for their circumstances. We like to say, why don't you make better choices? Well, if your physical and built environment is such that your choices are limited, you're only going to be able to choose things that are available to you in your physical and/or built environment. And what that leads to is either one, being able to achieve on course or off course, or on track or off track life course outcomes. There are things that need to be achieved in order for us to be successful in life. So for example, entering school ready to learn, or being proficient in math, reading, and/or your socio-emotional skills by a certain age or grade, so that you can ultimately graduate high school. Each of you that are GIS specialists and leaders in your field had to have received, a decent education, were more likely to graduate from high school, probably got certified or attended college at some place, and/or received a post-secondary credential with labor market value, which led to stable full-time employment, stable housing, and employment at a level that allows you to be a homeowner. If, for example, you had many off-track outcomes, such as being chronically absent from school, or having high degrees of school mobility or homelessness as a youth, you are more likely to not be proficient in math or English, or more likely to face behavioral problems or school discipline issues in school, or to have been retained, or less likely to have graduated from high school or make it to college. And all of those off-track factors lead to a reduction in housing stability, maybe higher rates of homelessness, and/or long-term underemployment or unemployment. And what we're looking to do in the county is understand and recognize that these structural pillars and ecological contexts influence the life course outcomes that we seek to achieve. And as we're aiming to improve conditions here in the county, we are identifying which life course outcomes have the greatest racial disparities, and are choosing and are building a county-wide strategic plan around those life course outcomes, which I'll share with you a little bit later today. Now, why is this important? And why is GIS important? Because neighborhood structural characteristics interfere with individual choice, right? Ultimately, individuals who have access to resources tend to stabilize the institutions in their community. And what is important to note is that affluence is actually a stronger predictor for health in areas or neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantage. Whereas stable poverty and social isolation lead to declining socioeconomic structures, may limit one's individual opportunities and options as well as choice, and may make it more difficult for us to maintain social support and stability within a community, to transmit positive health behaviors, and overall to ensure that a neighborhood has collective efficacy. How did we get here, folk? I started with those disparities at the top of the slide. Well, at the start of and founding of our country, there was one group of people who were exploited, whose bodies, labor, lives were exploited, were controlled violently for the benefit of another group of people. And even when that institution itself was eliminated in its previous form, a new institution rose in its place, which was strengthened through laws and policies and practices such as racially restrictive covenants that concentrated poverty in neighborhoods and reduced investment in those communities where exploitation existed. You had federal agencies like the Federal Housing Administration pass policies such as redlining, which prohibited the investments into communities where we now see historical forms of concentrated disadvantage. We also had, as segregation began to wane with the passing of the Civil Rights Act, subsequent emergence of policies, practices, and procedures that have maintained structural and institutional racism and discrimination within our current markets and current institutions today. So what this essentially means is that we're still living with the effects of structural racism within our institutions and within our society, which is why we see the outcomes that I shared with you at the top of the call, at the top of the discussion. This is why we see racial inequities and disparities in educational institutions, in our healthcare institutions, in our neighborhoods. This is why we see concentrated disadvantage and concentrated poverty. If you'd like to learn more about this, I would encourage you to read Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, to help really articulate the ways in which our policies and procedures and practices have led to the conditions that many communities face today. So why do we talk about racism in our society? We talk about it because it denotes structural and material constraints. And it's really about a relationship between those who have power and those who do not, right? It's about how we utilize our power in the institutions that we're a part of in ways that might both either intentionally or even unintentionally limit the self-development and self-determination of others. It also demonstrates that really, in many ways, race and racism is woven throughout our social institutions, both in how we think about and perceive others, but it's found in most aspects of life in our society. And as a colleague of mine likes to say, it's like sugar and water, or like salt and water, right? You stir it up and you don't see it in there, but if you taste it, you know it's there, right? And after a while, if you're not stirring it up, it'll settle at the bottom. And even though it becomes more clear, you may be able to see it. It's not always known that it's still in your water. So it saturates our experience. It saturates our environment. Even here in LA County, folk often want to know, well, what does this mean for us? And we're quote unquote a blue or a liberal place, right? I mean, we often like to think of ourselves as being progressive and being diverse. But even here in LA County, in the 50s and 60s, the federal government worked with our agencies to relocate and repatriate Native Americans from their land upon which they had treaties in Arizona, in Colorado, in New Mexico, in Utah, and move them to LA County, where we now have one of the largest Native American Indian urban populations in the country. They were encouraged to relocate for the promises of jobs and housing that never materialized. So now we have one of the highest rates of economic vulnerability in an urban Native American population here in the nation, located in LA County. Or for example, the Chinese American Massacre. In 1863, the state of California passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which meant that if you were considered a foreigner, actually, in Chinese or Asian, could have been Indian or Mongolian at the time, or any really Southeast Asian population, you did not have access to the law. So if a crime was committed against you, you couldn't report that the crime was committed against you. So in 1871, in downtown LA, where near Union Station, there was a massacre that occurred where more than 500 white mestizo persons marched on, at the time was Chinatown, and killed dozens of Chinese Americans who were never able to seek legal recourse. Or better yet, our county social workers were used in the 20s, 30s, and 40s to actually deport Mexican American citizens and repatriate them back to whatever country they were believed to come from. And what is really interesting to note is that when we often talk about working with people in our community to access resources, to build relationships with our county and our departments, these stories and these histories are still very much embedded in both the individual consciousness, but also within our communities, which leads to a lack of trust between our institutions and those communities. Furthermore, when we talk about modern day hate and violence against Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders or other communities, right, we can trace the same language that's being used against those communities to these experiences and laws and our policies that were passed and narratives that were used to help in many ways justify the killing and murder of those populations. Finally, and certainly last but not least, here in LA County, we had a community called South Central LA. We call it South LA today. But South Central LA was created because of both the 110 and 10 freeways. Freeways were built to move white communities to their jobs in central locations, often displacing African Americans. Entire neighborhoods or communities like Sugar Hill were wiped out, and it concentrated poverty and destroyed or segregated working class Black neighborhoods as well. Here's what's important to note, is that as these freeways were built, they were built under the auspices, in some cases, of quote unquote urban renewal. And again, you got to remember, neighborhoods of concentrated and accumulated disadvantage were created that way because they were divested from, or there may have been movements of resources out of those neighborhoods. So when the government came through to build a freeway, they often built those freeways through those neighborhoods where they considered them to be quote unquote blighted. And as a result, displaced many African Americans. One thing to note is that there was also something called the freeway revolts, where people in LA County would get onto the 10 freeway, or they would get onto the 405 freeway, and they would demand that those freeways would be rerouted. They would block the construction workers. They would prevent the bulldozers from doing their jobs, from moving through. And these communities would fight and sue government to make sure that these freeways never made it through their neighborhoods like Mulholland or Laurel Canyon or Santa Monica or Beverly Hills. In fact, these protesters were often white communities with more resources who wanted to ensure that these freeways never made it through their neighborhoods and were rerouted through African American neighborhoods. So why is LA County committed to anti-racism? What does that look like? Well, first, LA County recognized that we have a role to address, we have a role in systemic racism, and we must commit to changing systems, organizational structures, and policies, as well as co-create solutions with affected populations so we can address adverse outcomes utilizing a lens of racial equity. What's important to note is that when doing that, we can create interventions that increase economic mobility or advance health in environmentally disadvantaged areas or improve school quality. But in order to do that, we have to fundamentally understand what equality and equity means. So when it comes to understanding the difference between equality and equity, we must recognize that our systems and institutions, as I mentioned earlier, were established and created to either benefit or exclude certain populations. So much so that the disparities I started with at the top of this discussion are the outcomes that we experience. They were often rooted either intentionally or unintentionally in discriminatory practices or beliefs. So we often talk about equality, and equality is about maintaining the status quo in many ways. It's treating everybody the same, irrespective of their circumstance. So they're given the same resources and expected to take advantage of the same opportunities. Whereas when we talk about equity, it really acknowledges that every person has a different set of circumstances. They're starting from a different place. They have different backgrounds. And as a result, equity really centers this idea, this construct, that differences matter and that systems must be balanced to distribute resources, power, and opportunities in order to achieve the equal outcomes that we're trying to ensure that all folk in our society are able to accomplish. The goal with equity is to treat people justly according to their circumstances, to take into consideration the background and starting place they may have. And racial equity is ultimately about getting to a place where, no one's either burdened or benefited or receiving society's burdens or benefits simply because of their race, right? The idea here is that we get to a place where it doesn't matter. Race is not a factor to determine whether or not you're able to own a home or whether or not you're able to go to a high quality school, right? It's really about us eliminating overall societal level discrimination so that individuals can achieve self-determination. But when we talk about anti-racism, right, we can try and achieve racial equity, we can try and focus on equity, but LA County is committed to being an anti-racist institution. And that means that we have to proactively identify where these structures and these policies and these practices exist so that we can redistribute those resources and power equitably in order to eliminate racism as well. So in July of 2020, shortly after the death of George Floyd, our Board of Supervisors adopted a motion declaring that racism was a matter of public health and that it had risen to crisis proportion, especially for African-American residents. And as a result, directed the CEO's office to establish a unit and the board itself also established an 8th board directed priority to address the elimination of structural racism and bias within the county. I was honored to be asked to come on board to help lead that unit, and we're currently engaged in developing a countywide racial equity strategic plan. In the Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion unit, we're providing training and capacity building for departments. We're assisting them by providing technical assistance in planning, policy analysis, and development. We're working with them to help strengthen data collection, analysis, and reporting in partnership with many of our friends, including our Internal Services Department and our Chief Information Officer. But we're also supporting community and stakeholder engagement, as well as equity-infused programming and resourcing. And we're building up on the board's focus on equity and partnership with many of our local governments and agencies, as well as unincorporated and incorporated cities, school districts, and jurisdictions, as well as community-based organizations, philanthropic organizations, and academic institutions. So when you're looking to operationalize racial equity in government, it's really about building a team of people. So we've worked closely with each of our departments to build what's called a racial equity action team. And that team is participating in and leading trainings. We're rolling out a series of tools for them to use at the departmental level. And this is some of the work that we're supporting beyond the county with other agencies as well. We're helping to build their equity action plans. And what I think makes the use of GIS so important is that we're working with them to create and utilize measurement frameworks to assess whether or not the outcomes they're seeking to achieve are actually being achieved, while deepening their engagement with community members and building capacity. In practice, we have more than 200 countywide departmental staff that are leading these efforts, that are participating in trainings, and that are rolling out the use of these tools, that are building a countywide training framework, and aligning our strategic efforts with accountability measures. And when we talk about the use of racial equity tools, the use of GIS is so incredibly important, because what we're trying to ultimately achieve is improving positive life course outcomes, right? We want to support positive life trajectories from birth all the way through the time that we leave a legacy here, as well as aiming to prevent negative life outcomes. The way this works is we're indexing those life course outcomes and identifying, creating a root cause analysis to identify what are the drivers of those life course outcomes. And then we're mapping those outcomes by identifying where the county has an opportunity to influence, shifting those outcomes, or aligning those outcomes with existing programs or services, or determining whether or not new programs or services are needed, and then building action and accountability plans as a result. So these are the 5 primary life course outcomes that our countywide that our departments have landed on and our community members have landed on, with really the goal to close racial disparities and shift opportunities over time. And so we're centered on reducing adult lifetime imprisonment and increasing stable employment, full-time employment at a living wage, as well as, for example, increasing completion of a post-secondary credential with labor market value, not sending somebody to a private college or to like an ITT Tech. And while that may have been a great place for some people to go to, what we note is that many of the graduates who left a place like ITT Tech or many private colleges left with a great deal of debt and not a lot of opportunity to actually enter into the workforce. Furthermore, we're centered on reducing infant mortality, as well as increasing percentage of households with income at 250% above the federal poverty level. And these life course outcomes will help demonstrate the greatest improvements in opportunity and close some of the greatest disparities that we experience here in LA County. So we start with disparities and we end with disparities. And by utilizing GIS, we're able to advance racial equity. Now, in practice, I'm proud to say, in working with the Internal Services Division, that we're able to apply this now to the American Rescue Plan Act dollars that have come down the pike. The American Rescue Plan Act really centers equity and wants to ensure that we're aiming to recover from the pandemic and target communities that are most in need. Furthermore, our Board of Supervisors adopted a motion to strategically utilize those funds to maximize benefit to communities who are suffering disproportionately as a result of the pandemic. We work closely with our partners within multiple departments to both align the Department of Treasury guidance as well as the Board of Supervisors motion, develop a set of tools that are frankly really a set of processes and templates that departments utilize to screen their funding proposals in order to allocate their dollars to the communities with the greatest need. So when we talk about utilizing GIS, it's incredibly essential, right? Because you got to know where the communities with the greatest needs are. We developed a set of indices and created one primary index called the COVID Vulnerability and Recovery Index, which takes these three left columns or these indices on the left and combines them to identify geographically where neighborhoods are that have been most impacted by the pandemic. Furthermore, we've created layers to help our departments begin to analyze how they're using data to better target their resources and services. So if, for example, a department is providing food for people who are homeless, we want them to know, like, where are people more likely to be homeless, where are they more likely to be vulnerable in that neighborhood, so they can target their resources and target those programs to that specific neighborhood. Or if, for example, a department is aiming to increase enrollment in a specific program for a limited English speaking population, then we're able to create a layer of that data so that that department can understand exactly where to best target their resources to that population. Furthermore, we're partnering with our friends in the Internal Services Department to identify non-geographically concentrated communities, because we know that not everyone's going to be captured through the data that we have available, either through the census data or even our internal county departmental data. So we're building out a participatory mapping effort to help track and capture the needs of those populations as well. And we utilize mapping, and I want to thank our friends at ISD for sharing this. We utilize mapping because it helps us illuminate patterns, distributions, and hotspots, and it helps us better communicate visually, as well as fosters collaboration and cross-community understanding, amongst many others. I want to thank our friends from Esri for providing sort of how we connect the relationship between the decisions, the policies, the practices, and the programs that we have, as well as understanding its relationship to communities, assets, and conditions. Because it's not just about mapping where the challenges are, it's also about understanding where the resources are and how all of those combine to lead to specific outcomes. So this is an example of our Equity Explorer, which takes, as you can see here on the right, and I don't have enough time necessarily to demo this for all of you today, but this gives you a map of LA County, and the darkest purple sort of tracks that are identified here demonstrate where folk are more likely to have been impacted by the pandemic based upon the highest, high, moderate, low, and lowest quintiles. So you can see here in LA County where the neighborhoods are, where folk were most impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and are most in need of resources. Furthermore, our departments are able to overlay this COVID layer with other forms of data as well, to better understand how they should target and could target their resources. And again, thanking our friends from Esri, they're able to demonstrate, right? We're building out a deeper relationship so that we can see exactly how structural racism shows up in our neighborhoods. And as Shannon is sharing with you more about the tool, if you go to the demo, you'll see, for example, we can do a layer and overlay the neighborhood redlining grade. And what's incredible is you can see how those neighborhoods themselves still have, are places where historical and concentrated disadvantage exists. You can also see how those neighborhoods may have assets to help individuals overcome some of those challenges, or may have assets where those challenges may be exacerbated, like dilapidated housing or poor quality schools, et cetera. So all of these things become really important bits of information and data to inform the ways in which we want to make decisions around our programming, how we target our resources, how we move those resources to places so that we can make our parks safe, increase tree canopy, reduce urban heat island effect, strengthen access to jobs and economic opportunities, better target our services, realign where contracts are going so that, someone who may need, for example, a parenting class is not driving 3 hours across town to get there. Because if any of you have ever driven in LA County, which many of you probably have, or if you've not yet driven in LA County or you've taken public transportation, you know that traffic can be a problem. So if you have a court order, for example, to get to another side of town to take a parenting class so you can reunify with your child, it can take you 2 or 3 hours. And if you have to work 8 hours a week or 9 or 10 hours a week, and you have to go to that parenting class, the challenges can become insurmountable. And if, as I mentioned before, we see a growth in disadvantaged families when income earners are taken out of the household or a child is moved into our child welfare protection or safety system, that child may be more likely to move into our incarceration system, or may be more likely to face poor health outcomes later on down the road. I'm going to try and get through these last few slides, but we've developed a set of strategies to help us address non-geographically concentrated communities, and as a result are working to identify, this is sort of the beta dashboard. We have a final version that's being built at this time, but we'll be able to show how we're spending our dollars, where those monies are being located, and where the programs and services are being provided based upon the need that's been identified. So the relationship between mapping, spending, project design, or projects that are being developed and rolled out in communities is incredibly important so that the public can understand how the county is better utilizing its resources to meet the needs of our service and target populations. So I'm going to pause there, and I think we have just a few more minutes for Q&A, and go ahead and turn it back over to you, Dr. Steinberg.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Scorza, for a really great presentation. I like how you combined, the goals and objectives of the county with how GIS is able to support that. And I think that's an important message in a lot of contexts we'll be hearing over the next couple of days. We have several questions in the Q&A, so I'm just going to jump right in and we'll see how many we can cover. The first question from Oscar: has there been research into how Prop 13 has and continues to affect the unfair taxing issues?
Oscar, that's a great question. I do know that there has been research on Proposition 13 and its effect upon taxing. In fact, in California, we had a number of proposals and propositions that were passed to try and address this. There's another organization called California Forward, which is doing a lot of work on this as well, and ran a ballot initiative that unfortunately did not pass to further address these issues. But yes, the answer to that question is yes. But I'm not sure if we've linked that necessarily to the mapping work that we're doing, and perhaps that's an area we can explore.
All right. And a quick question from Max: is there a white paper available for the COVID Vulnerability and Recovery Index?
So Max, there's not a white paper, but there is a website you can visit, which we were able to rely upon to help build our COVID Vulnerability and Recovery Index. And I'm happy to share that website with you. It's called racecounts.org. And it is based upon a number of organizations that came together in partnership with the California Department of Public Health and other agencies to build out and identify the populations that were being impacted by the pandemic. So through a partnership of public health agencies and these community-based organizations, Race Counts articulates the importance of building these indices as well. So we utilize a similar methodology, although we did not incorporate the use of race or gender or any protected characteristic in our index. We were still able to identify communities that were most impacted by the pandemic.
Okay, well, thank you. The next question is a little bit longer from Kyle. He says, Dr. Scorza, our society has seen multiple versions of equity policy, from the integration of public schools to affirmative action. And I feel as though these policy solutions only mask systematic racism. Incarceration of African-American males is still not proportional to the actual African male population, for example. What makes RD different, and how can GIS keep on track in this equity mission?
Kyle, such an incredible question. And I just want to really acknowledge and lift up the work that you're doing in our Department of Parks and Rec, really helping to move the department forward as we consider how to better target and utilize our resources. And so thank you for that question. I think what makes ARDI different is that ARDI is centering racial disparities. You know, there are many efforts that have taken place. We're currently examining, for example, prevention throughout the entire county. There are a number of efforts that our county agencies and other governments have aimed to address or have aimed to enact, where they're trying to address, you know, the needs and services of our populations. But one of the things that has become incredibly clear, Kyle, is that a lot of those efforts didn't really center disparities. They didn't really look, for example, at how people are disproportionately impacted, and they didn't lift up the life course outcome model, or didn't utilize a racial equity framework. And so I think what makes ARDI different and what's making the work that we're doing in the county different is that we've actually brought not only a theoretical framework to the table, but we are actually helping to plan around results and ideal conditions and outcomes we're trying to achieve. Often programs are launched, and this is not the case for everybody, but sometimes programs are launched and folk are like, yeah, we think this is a great program, but they didn't actually drill down on how that program is going to lead to specific outcomes, nor are they mapping and tracking that data. And so we're helping to work with departments so that they capture the data, report on their outcomes, put it forward in a dashboard, report publicly, and have a level of accountability that frankly, you know, is not typical. And so that's one way. And then GIS can keep us on track by making that information visually available and accessible to multiple constituents, right? You know, I think GIS can be the way that we help people enter into the conversation, even though it still requires sort of a set of skills. You know, you know, a picture, you know, can tell 1,000 words, right? You know, seeing that map, seeing where redline, you know, locations are. I actually previewed, I teach in public health at UCLA. I previewed the Equity Explorer for some of my students. And afterward, I had about a dozen students come up to me and say, hey, you know, wow, I didn't realize redlining impacted these neighborhoods. I had just learned about that concept in my other class, or I hadn't heard about that concept. Now I can see why neighborhoods are facing the challenges that they are, right? So I think this ability to visualize inequities and visualize assets and overlay those assets can also help us target our resources. So if you know where the need is, then you can match your resources to that need.
All right, very good. And I have one more question that came in here just right now from Eva. How are you thinking about closing the racial wealth gap? For example, is the county considering down payment assistance programs or maybe others that you know of?
Eva, thank you so much for that question. There are a number of ways that the county is working to close the racial wealth gap. And the first thing is by identifying a life course outcome. So if you notice, one of the 5 outcomes, there are 2 in the 5 outcomes that we selected that really focus on this issue. One is increasing stable employment at a living wage. In LA County, we know that a living wage is not the same as sort of, you know, average median income, right? You need to be able to afford to live here. So setting that goal target is really important, and then aligning programs and identifying which programs align with that life course outcome is really important. So for example, an employment opportunity program or a pipeline program into a fire, you know, job, for example, is a good example of how we can achieve a closing in disparities as it relates to the racial equity, the racial wealth gap. Or for example, the other life course outcome we have is increasing income at 250% above the federal poverty level, so that people can actually get to the place where they no longer need county services, but instead they're able to purchase their home, et cetera. So those types of life course outcomes can help drive the services and the programs that we're building out, that our departments are building out and executing, and making sure that they're able to examine whether or not that program is leading to the specific outcome that they intended to. There are grant programs that the county makes available, for example, for small businesses to help keep them in operation during the pandemic. That's our commercial rent relief program, which just went live on the 17th. It actually goes live today. So I just want to thank our friends at the LA, at LACDA, the Community Development Authority here, for launching that program. But then there are other efforts that are underway, like a Business Incubator Academy, and just a number of things that the county is doing that we're working to help illuminate so that the public is aware about the many services the county is providing to address the racial wealth gap. So with that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for the opportunity to join today. I want to thank you to our GIS team and our Internal Services Department for your incredible work. Really want to lift up the hard work that so many of you do, and just acknowledge that, if we're ever going to get to a place where we're achieving racial equity, that your leadership and your expertise are incredibly needed to advance the field and advance this work. So again, thank you for the opportunity to join, and I'll turn it back over to you, Steve.
All right. Well, thank you again, Dr. Scorza, for a great talk and taking time to answer the fantastic questions we've had. We are going to take a short break. It's about 3 minutes to the top of the hour. We will resume at 11 with our talk on Locate Hate LA. And then again at 11:30 will be a presentation that will demo the Equity Explorer Dr. Scorza just spoke about. So we'll see you just in about 2 or 3 minutes. And thank you again for joining us.